They say your wedding day is supposed to be the happiest day of your life, a curated masterpiece of white lace, expensive promises, and the beginning of a forever that everyone tells you is guaranteed. They paint it in soft pastels and tell you that the glow in your eyes is the light of love. But for me, that day became something entirely different. It became the day I buried a 5-year lie under the weight of 1,000 white roses. It was the day I rose from the ashes of a shattered dream, not as a wife, but as a woman who chose herself. My name is a story of survival, and today I am taking you back to the morning the sun rose on a version of my life that was destined to die before sunset. We often talk about betrayal as something that happens in the dark, in the quiet corners of a relationship when no one is looking, but I decided to bring my betrayal into the blinding light of a 1,000-watt spotlight. Welcome to Echoes of Love and Betrayals, the sanctuary for those who have learned that love is often tested in the fires of deception, and that true courage is what remains when the smoke finally clears. Today's story is for anyone who has ever felt the crushing weight of a secret, for anyone who has been told to keep quiet for the sake of appearances, and for those who have realized that dignity is worth more than any diamond ring. Before we step into the bridal suite, before the music swells and the guests take their seats, I need to ask you a question that cuts through the noise. If you held the truth in your hand on the most important day of your life, would you have the strength to let it shatter everything to save yourself? Or would you walk down that aisle hoping that a lie told at the altar could eventually become a truth? I want you to be honest with me. Go to the comments right now, pause the video and type, "I choose me," or "I would wait." Tell me where you are listening from, whether you are in Nigeria, the United States, London, Canada, or anywhere across the globe. We are a community that values the truth over comfort, and I want to know who is standing with me today. Because today, we are going to witness what happens when a bride stops being a victim and starts being her own hero. Take a deep breath. The morning light is streaming through the windows. The dress is waiting. Let's begin.
The morning light streamed through the bridal suite windows, soft, golden, and deceptively forgiving, as if the sun itself wanted to bless a union that was already rotting from the inside out. White roses, the symbol of purity and new beginnings, filled every corner of the room, their scent so thick it felt like it was trying to drown out the smell of my own fear. My wedding dress hung from the heavy mahogany armoire like a promise waiting to be kept, a breathtaking architecture of silk and hand-stitched pearls that I had spent months choosing. Everyone who entered the room kept telling me how calm I looked. They marveled at my steady hands as I sipped my tea. They complimented the serene glow on my face as the makeup artist applied the final touches. What they didn't know was that calm isn't always peace. Sometimes, calm is just the absolute clarity that comes right before the storm. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the room is the woman who has stopped hoping and started knowing. I slicked my phone into my silk clutch, the screen still glowing faintly with the ghost of the messages I had read at 2:17 a.m. while the rest of the world slept in blissful ignorance. Those words had shattered the version of love I had trusted for 5 years into a million jagged pieces that I was now forced to walk across. I can't wait until after today. She has no idea. This will all be over soon. The messages weren't meant for me. They were a digital trail of a secret life sent from the man I was supposed to vow my soul to, addressed to the woman who was currently pinning my veil into place. My maid of honor, Leela, was bustling around the room with a nervous, frantic energy, rambling about seating charts, flower girl baskets, and the exact timing of the processional. She smiled at me in the mirror, her eyes bright with a performance of friendship that was so perfect it was nauseating. She didn't see the way my hands trembled beneath the silk of my robe, not from the bridal jitters she kept joking about, but from a cold, hard resolve that was setting in my bones like concrete. I sat there, letting them paint my face and curl my hair, feeling like an actress in a play where I was the only one who had been given the real script. I looked at Leela, the woman who had been my best friend since university, the woman who had held my hand through my father's funeral, and I realized that I didn't even know who she was. I watched her adjust the lace on my shoulder, her touch light and familiar, and I felt a surge of cold fury that I had to push down deep into my lungs just to keep breathing. I wasn't walking down that aisle blind. I wasn't the tragic figure in a romantic tragedy. I was walking in wide awake, with the eyes of a woman who was about to turn her own wedding into a courtroom. Every compliment from the bridesmaids, every "you're so lucky" from my mother felt like a match being struck against the dry wood of my heart. I knew that by the end of this day, this room would be empty. The roses would be wilted, and the man at the altar would finally see the woman he had spent 5 years underestimating. As the hour approached, the room began to clear out, leaving me alone with the silence and the weight of the dress. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, looking at the bride I was supposed to be. I looked beautiful, and that was the cruelest part of the lie. The veil was a mist of tulle that obscured the reality of the tears I had cried at 3 a.m., and the pearls were a necklace of secrets I was finally ready to break. I realized in that quiet moment that I wasn't afraid of the humiliation of a canceled wedding. I was afraid of the silence of a life built on a lie. I checked my clutch one last time to make sure the phone was there, my weapon, my evidence, my truth. The music began to drift up from the lakefront, a swelling orchestral melody that signaled the start of the end. I took one final deep breath, smoothing the silk over my hips. I wasn't going down there to say I do. I was going down there to say I know. And as I turned toward the door, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. The wedding was a lie, but the woman walking toward it was finally, for the first time in 5 years, completely honest.
The music swelled, a grand, sweeping arrangement of strings that was designed to make hearts flutter and eyes tear up with the romance of it all. To the guests sitting in the rows of white chairs overlooking the lake, I was the vision of a woman about to fulfill her destiny. To them, the lake was a perfect mirror for the sky, blue and serene. But to me, it looked like a deep, cold void waiting to swallow the version of me that had been foolish enough to believe in Julian. I stepped forward onto the petal-strewn aisle, and for a moment the world seemed to slow down until I could hear the individual rustle of the wind through the trees. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, the weight of the silk train behind me feeling like the anchor of a ship that had already sunk. I looked at the faces of my friends and family, the people who had traveled miles to witness a lie, and I felt a profound sense of responsibility. I wasn't just walking toward a man, I was walking toward the end of an era. He stood at the altar in a tailored charcoal suit, looking every bit the man I had fallen in love with 5 years ago. He was the man who had sworn fidelity in the quiet moments of our kitchen, the man who had practiced his vows in front of the mirror until they sounded like poetry, the man who had kissed my forehead only yesterday and told me I was his forever. As I drew closer, he smiled. It was that same practiced smile, the one that had always made me feel safe, the one that had blinded me to the missing hours and the suspicious phone calls. In that moment, that smile almost broke me. It was so perfect, so polished that a part of me, the weak, desperate part that still wanted to be a bride, wanted to ignore the phone in my clutch. It wanted to close its eyes, say the words, and live in the beautiful, gilded cage he had built for us. But then I caught a glimpse of Lila standing just a few feet behind him. She was smiling too, a soft, supportive expression that hid the venom of the messages I had read. The clarity hit me then, sharper than the cold lake wind. I realized that their betrayal wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a collaborative effort to humiliate me while I paid for the privilege. Julian's smile wasn't for me, it was the smile of a man who thought he had successfully managed a difficult situation. He thought I was a piece of property he had already bought and paid for. As I reached the end of the aisle and my father placed my hand in Julian's, I felt a physical jolt of electricity, not the spark of love, but the shock of a predator touching its prey. His hand was warm, and he squeezed mine gently, leaning in to whisper, "You look beautiful, Naomi." I didn't whisper back. I just looked into his eyes and saw the hollowness there. I was walking in a wake, and for the first time in 5 years, the man standing in front of me was a total stranger. The officiant began to speak, his voice a low, comforting drone about the sacredness of commitment and the spiritual weight of the promises we were about to make. Each word he spoke about loyalty and honesty felt like a match being struck against my skin. I stood there, a statue in white, listening to the crowd's soft ahs and the clicking of the photographer's camera. I was no longer a participant in a wedding, I was a witness at a crime scene. I felt the phone in my clutch pressing against my side, a silent reminder of the truth I was carrying. The lake behind us was calm, but beneath the surface, I knew the currents were shifting. I wasn't waiting for my turn to say "I do." I was waiting for the moment the music stopped and the real story began. I looked up at the large screen behind the altar, usually meant for the How We Met slideshow, and I knew that in just a few minutes it would become the mirror that reflected Julian's true face to the world.
The air by the lake was deceptively still, but to me it felt heavy with the suffocating metallic scent of an impending storm. The officiant, a man with a kind, weathered face and a voice like aged velvet, began the traditional opening of the ceremony. He spoke of marriage as a harbor, a sacred place where two souls find refuge from the world's chaos. He talked about the sanctity of the vows we were about to exchange, calling them the foundational stones of a life built together in truth and light. Every word he uttered felt like a physical blow to my chest, a rhythmic, hollow pounding that made it hard to draw a full breath. I looked out at the guests, my aunts in their floral Sunday hats, Julian's high-powered business partners in their sharp, clinical suits, all of them leaning forward in their seats, hungry for a romantic spectacle. They wanted to see the perfect union, the climax of a 5-year fairy tale that had been curated specifically for their envy. They had no idea they were sitting in the front row of a total demolition. Julian stood opposite me, his confidence radiating off him in waves that felt almost oily. He was so sure of himself, so certain that he had successfully managed the 2 women in his life like he managed his high-stakes investment portfolios. I could see the slight, satisfied curve of his mouth, the look of a man who believed he was winning at the game of life. He thought he was about to secure a wife who would bring him social status, stability, and a polished home, while he kept his dark, secret thrills tucked away in the shadows of cheap hotel rooms and encrypted apps. Behind him, Leela stood as my maid of honor, holding my bouquet of white lilies. Her expression was a masterpiece of practiced, sisterly devotion. I wondered, as the officiant droned on about unfailing loyalty, how they could stand so physically close to me and not feel the heat of the fire I was about to light. How could they look at my white lace dress and not see it as a shroud for the thousands of lies they had told me over Sunday brunches and late-night drinks? The hypocrisy was so thick, it was a wonder the very flowers in her hands didn't turn to ash. When it finally came time for the vows, the officiant turned to me first, his eyes twinkling with the misplaced joy of a man who thinks he's witnessing a miracle. This was the moment the script called for me to pledge my eternity to a man who had already bartered it away for a few hours of cheap excitement. The silence that fell over the lakefront was absolute, broken only by the distant, lonely cry of a bird circling above. Julian adjusted his stance, pulling his shoulders back and preparing to look moved by my words for the benefit of the cameras. He reached for my hands, his touch familiar, warm, and utterly possessive. But I didn't take them. I kept my hands folded tightly over the small silk clutch tucked against my side. I looked him in the eye, really looked at the man I thought I knew, and for the first time, I saw the flicker of unease behind his charm. He noticed the lack of a bridal smile. He noticed that my eyes weren't wet with the joy of a union, but sharp with a cold, terrifying lucidity that made him flinch. "I have something to share," I said. My voice wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, ringing bell that carried across the water to the very back row of the gallery. I didn't wait for permission from the officiant. I didn't look at my mother for guidance. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone, the metal feeling cold and heavy against my palm. A collective ripple moved through the crowd, a low hum of confusion, and the sound of chairs creaking as people leaned in. This wasn't in the ivory-colored program. This wasn't the soft, emotional beginning they had paid to see. I could see my mother's brow furrow in the front row, her hand moving to her throat in a gesture of instinctive alarm. I saw Julian's lawyer stiffen, his professional instincts sensing a disaster. But I didn't stop. I stood at that altar, not as a woman about to be joined to a man, but as a woman about to set herself free. I was supposed to marry a man today.
The gasp that went through the audience was a physical thing, a sharp, collective intake of breath that seemed to suck every bit of oxygen out of the afternoon air. Julian's face drained of color so quickly, it was as if a ghost had walked through his body. He moved toward me, his hand outstretched as if he could physically catch the words I had spoken and shove them back into my mouth. "Sarah, stop," he hissed, his voice a panicked, urgent whisper that didn't carry to the guests but landed on me like lead. "Whatever you think you know, whatever you've misinterpreted, this isn't the time or the place. We can talk about this in private, please." I looked at him, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't see the man who was my world. I saw a small, desperate liar trying to protect a reputation that was already burning to ash. "Don't," I said softly. That one word carried more weight than a scream. It stopped him in his tracks. I turned toward the back of the altar, where a massive digital screen had been set up to show our childhood photos and our engagement video. The technician, who I had paid a significant sum to follow my specific cues, regardless of Julian's orders, hit the play button. But there was no romantic music. There was no slideshow of us laughing on a beach in Maui or holding hands in the park. Instead, the screen flickered to life with high-resolution, scrolling screenshots of the messages I had extracted from my phone. The font was large, clear, and unmistakable. Every guest in the room, from the front row to the very back, could see the timestamps: 2:17 a.m., 1:04 a.m., 11:45 p.m. They could see the raw, intimate words. "I can't wait until after today. She has no idea. This will all be over soon and we can be together." And then, the most devastating part appeared, the contact name at the top of the screen in bold, undeniable letters: Leela. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the very flowers beneath our feet. I turned the phone outward, matching the evidence on the giant screen with the device in my hand. I watched the front row. My mother's face went from confusion to a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Julian's business partners looked away, unable to meet my eyes or his, their loyalty evaporating in the heat of the truth. But the most visceral reaction came from Leela. She was standing just 3 feet behind me, wearing her silk bridesmaid's dress, still holding my bouquet. The lilies shook in her hands with a violent tremor until she couldn't hold them anymore. They hit the wooden floor with a soft, dull thud, the sound of a friendship dying in public. She didn't try to deny it. She didn't offer a defense. She just stood there, her eyes wide and wet, while the world saw exactly what she had been doing in the dark. "I won't stand here today and pretend," I said, my voice finally cracking as the first real hot tears began to fall. "I won't pretend that betrayal is something I should swallow for the sake of appearances, for the comfort of the guests, or for the preservation of a man's ego. I won't start a marriage built on a foundation of calculated lies and a bed shared with the woman I called my sister." I looked at Julian, who was now staring at the screen as if he could wish the digital ink away. His polished, expensive mask was gone, replaced by a raw, ugly fear. He looked small. He looked pathetic. I realized in that moment that I wasn't the one who should be embarrassed. I wasn't the one who should be hiding. I was the only person at this altar who was telling the truth. And as the whispers in the crowd turned into a roar of shock, I felt the first spark of a different kind of fire. This wasn't the end of my life. It was the end of his power over me.
The silence of a crowd is never truly silent. It is a heavy, living thing made of held breath and the friction of bodies shifting in shock. As the screenshots continued to scroll on the massive screen behind us, the reality of what had occurred began to settle into the marrow of everyone present. I stood perfectly still, a pillar of white silk and iron resolve, watching the destruction of the 2 people I had loved most in the world. Julian was no longer looking at the screen. He was looking at his feet, his chest heaving as if he were struggling to find enough air in the vast, open space of the lakeshore. And then there was Leela. The sound of the lilies hitting the floor had been soft, but in the vacuum of that moment, it sounded like a gavel coming down. She stood there, her hands now empty and trembling, looking at the fallen flowers as if they were a corpse. She didn't look up. She couldn't. I turned my head slowly to look at her, my maid of honor, my confidant, the woman who had helped me pick out this very dress. For a moment, the world narrowed down to just the 2 of us. I wanted to see the monster. I wanted to see the villain who could look me in the eye while plotting to steal my life. But all I saw was a hollowed-out version of the woman I thought I knew. Her face was a mask of ruin, the carefully applied makeup smearing as tears finally began to track through the foundation. She looked at me for a split second, and the guilt in her eyes was so thick it was suffocating. She had sat at my kitchen table and drank wine with me while I talked about my future with Julian. She had listened to my fears and whispered, "He's the one, Zara. You deserve this happiness." Every word she had ever spoken to me now felt like a drop of poison that had been sitting in my system for years, waiting for this specific moment to kill me. Julian finally looked up, but he didn't look at me. He looked at the crowd, his instinct for self-preservation kicking in, even as his world crumbled. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy, a pathetic shadow of the booming, confident tone he used in boardrooms. Those messages, they're out of context. Someone hacked my phone. Zara, you're being emotional. You're not thinking clearly. This is a misunderstanding." He stepped toward me again, his hand reaching out to grab my arm, to exert that physical control he had always used to calm me down whenever I questioned his late nights. But I stepped back, and the look I gave him stopped him cold. It was the look of a woman who was no longer a participant in his delusions. "The context is that you were planning to marry me while sleeping with her," I said, my voice cutting through his lies like a blade. "The context is that you thought I was too stupid to see you. You didn't just break a heart today, Julian. You broke a life, and you did it in front of everyone who ever believed in you." The reaction from the guests was no longer a whisper. It was an eruption. My brother stood up in the second row, his face a mask of fury, his hands balled into fists as he took a step toward the altar. I saw Julian's mother cover her face with her hands, shaking her head in a rhythmic motion of denial. The air was thick with the sound of, "How could he?" and "Poor Zara." But I didn't want their pity. I didn't want to be the tragic bride of the year. I watched as Leela finally broke. She turned and began to stumble away from the altar, her silk dress snagging on a floral arrangement, her heels sinking into the soft grass as she fled toward the parking lot. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't offer an apology. She just ran, leaving the man she had betrayed me with standing alone at an altar that had turned into a pillory. Julian watched her go, and for the first time the realization of his total isolation hit him. He looked back at me, and I could see the exact moment he realized that there was no way out of this. There was no apology large enough, no lie clever enough, and no misunderstanding that could fix the fact that he had lost everything in the span of 10 minutes.
The chaos that followed Leela's flight was a discordant symphony of human emotion. The guests were no longer a polite audience. They were a hive of indignation and bewilderment. Julian stood in the center of the storm, his eyes darting from the empty space where Leela had stood to the massive screen that still displayed the digital proof of his infidelity. He looked like a man who had been stripped naked in a blizzard, shivering, exposed, and utterly powerless. He tried to speak again, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but the crowd's roar drowned him out. My brother was held back by two cousins, his shouts of, "Look at her! Look at what you did!" cutting through the air. The officiant stood frozen, his prayer book trembling in his hands, looking like a man who had seen a cathedral collapse in front of him. But in the middle of this hurricane of sound, I was the only point of absolute stillness. I looked down at the white silk of my dress. For months I had been told that this fabric made me look like a queen, like a woman who had finally won the ultimate prize. But now I didn't feel like a bride. I felt like a survivor who had just crawled out of a wreckage. The adrenaline that had carried me through the exposure was beginning to cool into a hard, crystalline resolve. I realized that everyone in this room was waiting for me to do one of two things: either collapse into a heap of white lace and be carried off in a fit of hysterics, or run away like Leela, hiding my face in shame. They expected the tragedy to follow its traditional path. Julian certainly expected it. He was already shifting his posture, looking for a way to play the role of the concerned partner to a distraught woman. He thought that if I broke down, he could regain control of the narrative. He thought my pain would be his shield. I looked at the lake behind him, the water that was supposed to witness my union. It was dark now, the sun beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the grass. I realized then that I didn't want to run. I didn't want to hide.
This day had been paid for with my money, my time, and 5 years of my misplaced devotion. The flowers were beautiful, the food was prepared, and the people I loved, the people who actually cared for me, were all standing right here. Why should I be the one to disappear? Why should the victim be the one to lose the celebration? I felt a sudden, sharp pivot in my chest, a change in the very purpose of my existence. I wasn't going to let Julian's betrayal rob me of my dignity, but I also wasn't going to let it rob me of my day. I was going to reclaim the very ground we were standing on. I stepped forward, moving back into the center of the altar, reclaiming the space that Julian was still occupying with his hollow presence. I didn't look at him. I looked past him, directly into the eyes of the guests in the front row. I raised my hand, a silent command for order that worked better than a gavel. Slowly, the shouts died down. The whispers faded. My brother stopped struggling and looked at me with a mixture of confusion and awe. Even the wind seemed to quiet its rustle in the trees. I stood there, tall and unyielding, the light of the sunset catching the pearls on my bodice. Julian tried to step toward me, his voice a pathetic whimper. "Zara, please, let's just go inside. Let's talk." I turned my head just enough to look at him, and the coldness in my gaze was enough to make him stumble back. "You've said enough, Julian," I said, my voice resonating with a power I hadn't known I possessed. "Today is no longer about you. In fact, nothing in my life will ever be about you again. You are a guest who has stayed far too long, and it is time for you to leave." The silence that followed my command for Julian to leave was heavy, thick with the kind of tension that makes your skin prickle. He didn't move at first. He stood there, his expensive shoes rooted to the spot, looking as though he expected a punchline to follow. But as my words settled over the crowd, a low murmur of agreement began to rise. My father and brother stepped forward, not with the explosive rage of minutes ago, but with a quiet, lethal finality. They didn't have to say a word. They simply stood on either side of the altar, creating a wall of bone and blood that Julian couldn't pass. Seeing the shift in the room, Julian finally realized that his charm had no currency here. He looked at me one last time, not with love, but with a desperate, wounded ego. And then he turned, walking past the rows of guests who pulled their chairs away as he passed, as if his very shadow was contagious. With the source of the rot removed, the altar felt strangely vast. The officiant was still standing there, his hands trembling as he closed his book. "Zara," he whispered, his voice cracking with sympathy, "I am so sorry. We can end this now. I'll let the guests know the ceremony is concluded." He began to step away, but I reached out and touched his arm. It was a gentle gesture, but firm. "No," I said, my voice carrying to the very back of the tent. "The ceremony isn't over. It's just finally becoming honest." A wave of confusion rippled through the rows of guests. I could see my bridesmaids, the ones who weren't Leela, clutching their dresses, their faces pale and uncertain. They expected me to run. They expected me to hide in the bridal suite and cry until my eyes were swollen. But I wasn't that woman anymore. That woman had died at 2:17 a.m. when the first message appeared on my screen. I stepped closer to the edge of the altar, looking out at the faces of the people who had loved me through every phase of my life. I saw my mother, her eyes red from crying, but her posture straightening as she watched me. I realized that this day had been framed as a union between two people, but marriage, at its core, is a promise of protection. It is a vow of loyalty. And for 5 years I had offered those things to a man who used them as weapons against me. I had abandoned my own instincts, silenced my own doubts, and shrunk my own soul to fit into the spaces Julian allowed me to inhabit.
I had been a faithful wife to a ghost while being a stranger to the woman in the mirror. I reached out and took the gold band from the velvet pillow that was still resting on the small table. It was the ring I was supposed to place on Julian's finger, a circle meant to represent eternity. I held it up, the sunset catching the polished metal, and I looked at it not as a symbol of a failed marriage, but as a promise that was finally finding its true recipient. I have spent 5 years promising to love, honor, and cherish a man who did none of those things for me. Today was supposed to be about a commitment to another person, but standing here in the wreckage of that lie, I realized that the most sacred commitment I can make is the one I have neglected for far too long. I looked at the ring, then back at the guests. I choose me. The silence was no longer heavy, it was electric. I slipped the ring onto my own finger, the right hand, a mark of a different kind of union. I vow, I said, looking into the eyes of my family, to never again abandon my own intuition for the sake of comfort. I vow to protect my peace as fiercely as I once protected his secrets. I will be the partner to myself that I was so willing to be for him. I am not a victim today. I am a woman who is finally meeting herself at the altar. As I spoke those words, a single person in the back row began to clap, then another. Within seconds, the entire tent was filled with a thunderous, rhythmic applause that felt like it was lifting the very roof off the structure. It wasn't the polite, obligatory clapping of a wedding. It was a roar of recognition. I stood there, alone at the altar, my head held high, the ring cold and solid on my finger, realizing that I hadn't lost a husband, I had gained a life.
The applause eventually faded, replaced by a strange humming energy that vibrated through the grass. The air felt lighter, as if a thick, poisonous fog had finally been cleared by the wind. But as I stood there, basking in the warmth of my own resolve, I saw the final remnants of the rot being purged. Julian hadn't left the property yet. He had been lingering at the edge of the tent, perhaps hoping for a moment of weakness, a second thought, or a chance to pull me aside and work his linguistic magic one last time. But my father and brother were no longer just standing guard. They were moving. They were a slow, unstoppable tide of protective fury, guiding Julian toward the gravel path that led to the parking lot. I watched from my high ground at the altar as Julian tried to maintain some shred of his dignity, adjusting his jacket and looking back over his shoulder, but he looked like a man who had been hollowed out. He was no longer the star of the show. He was the trash being taken out after the party. Beyond Julian, near the far side of the lake, I saw a flash of silk, the dusty rose of Lila's bridesmaid dress. She wasn't running anymore. She was staggering, her heels abandoned in the mud, her bare feet stumbling over the uneven ground. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, stripped of the glamour and the borrowed confidence she had worn all morning. She reached her car, but she couldn't get the door open. Her hands were shaking too violently. No one went to help her. None of the other bridesmaids, women she had called friends for years, moved a muscle. They stood in a tight, silent line, watching her with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. In a world of social grace and high-stakes appearances, Lila had committed the ultimate sin. She had been caught. And as she finally managed to scramble into her car and speed away, the tires throwing up a cloud of dust that tasted like failure, I realized that her punishment wasn't just losing me, it was having to live with the person she saw in the mirror every morning, the woman who would always know she was second choice even in her betrayal. Julian's exit was slower, more agonizing. He reached his sleek, black luxury sedan, the car we had picked out together, the car that was supposed to whisk us away to our honeymoon. He stood by the driver's side door for a long minute, looking back at the tent, at the lights, and at me. I stood perfectly still, my arms folded over the white lace of my bodice, the gold ring on my finger catching the last of the sun. I didn't give him a tear. I didn't give him a scream. I gave him the one thing a narcissist cannot survive: absolute indifference. I looked through him as if he were made of glass. When he finally realized that there was no later, no we can talk, and no path back into my life, he got in and drove away. The sound of his engine fading into the distance was the most beautiful music of the entire ceremony. It was the sound of a parasite being removed from its host. The silence that followed their departure was different from the silence of betrayal. It was a clean silence. I looked at the officiant, who was still standing by my side, looking a bit dazed but deeply moved. He reached out and touched my hand, not the one with the ring, but the one that was still holding the phone. "Zara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "I have performed hundreds of marriages in my life. I have seen love in all its forms, but I have never seen a person honor the truth the way you did today. You may not have signed a certificate, but you have performed a miracle of the spirit." I thanked him, my voice steady, and stepped down from the altar. As I walked back toward the guests, I didn't see pity in their eyes. I saw a new kind of respect. I wasn't the poor bride whose wedding was ruined. I was the woman who had transformed a slaughterhouse into a sanctuary. I walked toward my mother, who opened her arms wide, and as I stepped into her embrace, I realized that for the first time in 5 years, I could finally breathe without feeling like I was taking up someone else's space.
The transition from the altar to the reception hall is usually a blur of nervous laughter and rehearsed joy, but as I walked toward the grand, glass-walled pavilion, the air felt charged with a different kind of electricity. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, bruised indigo, and the thousands of fairy lights draped over the trees began to twinkle like fallen stars. Usually, the bride and groom enter to a roar of applause and a specific song, their hands entwined, presenting a united front to the world. But as the double doors of the pavilion swung open, I walked in alone. The music, a jazz ensemble I had hand-picked months ago, stuttered for a half-second before finding its rhythm again. The room was a masterpiece of ivory linens, towering floral centerpieces, and the warm, golden glow of 100 candles. It was a room designed for a celebration, and I decided, as I felt the collective gaze of 200 people hit me, that I wasn't going to let that design go to waste. I walked straight to the head table, the long, elevated desk that was supposed to seat Julian, myself, and our loyal wedding party. I saw the empty chairs where Julian and Leela were supposed to be sitting, their name cards still resting on the table in elegant gold calligraphy. To anyone else, those empty seats would have been a glaring reminder of failure, a gaping wound in the middle of the party. But to me, they were the most beautiful sights in the room. They were spaces cleared of poison. I walked over, picked up Julian's name card, and calmly tore it in half, letting the pieces flutter to the floor like snow. Then I picked up his champagne flute, raised it toward the room, and sat down in the center chair. I wasn't hiding in the bridal suite with a box of tissues. I was taking my place at the head of my own table. A hush fell over the room as I stood back up, the microphone in my hand. I could see the caterers frozen in the corners, the servers holding their trays, and my guests watching me with bated breath. I knew they were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the graceful exit speech, where I apologized for the drama and sent everyone home with a gift bag and a heavy heart. But I looked at them, my college friends, my mentors, my cousins, and I realized that these people had come to celebrate love. And if the love I had for Julian was a lie, the love these people had for me was the most tangible thing in the room. Tonight,
I said, my voice echoing clearly off the glass walls, was supposed to be a celebration of a union between two people, but instead it has become a celebration of a union with the truth. I paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. The food is world class, the bar is open, and the music is playing. I am going nowhere, and I hope you won't either. Tonight, we don't celebrate a marriage, we celebrate a beginning. The roar that followed was louder than any applause at the altar. It was the sound of a room coming back to life. My brother was the first to reach the bar, ordering a round for his entire table, and slowly the rigid tension of the evening began to melt into something warmer, something more authentic. People began to move, to talk, to eat. I watched from my seat as the room transformed. This wasn't the stiff, formal event Julian had insisted on, a performance for his business associates. It became a riot of genuine connection. My bridesmaids came to sit by me, not out of obligation, but out of a fierce, protective sisterhood. We laughed until our sides ached, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to check Julian's face to see if my laughter was too loud or unbecoming. I was the host, the guest of honor, and the survivor, all at once. I ate the expensive salmon, I drank the vintage wine, and I realized that the best way to spite a man who tried to take your life is to live it exceptionally well right in front of the people he tried to impress.
As the dinner plates were cleared and the hum of conversation settled into a warm, rhythmic buzz, the bandleader looked toward the head table with a hesitant, questioning glance. The itinerary, the one Julian and I had agonized over for months, called for the first dance at exactly 9 p.m. It was supposed to be a carefully choreographed routine to a song about eternal devotion, a performance designed to make every woman in the room sigh with envy. The bandleader's hand hovered over his guitar, his eyes searching mine for a sign to skip it, to move straight into the upbeat tracks that would allow everyone to forget the empty chair beside me. I saw my mother lean forward, her face etched with a protective worry, ready to stand up and call an end to the formalities, to save me from the potential sting of a dance floor meant for two. But I didn't shake my head. I didn't look away. Instead, I stood up from my seat at the center of the table, my white silk train whispering against the floor like the wings of a bird. I walked toward the center of the empty, circular dance floor, the spotlights finding me and turning my dress into a shimmering column of light. A profound, expectant silence fell over the pavilion. I could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes, some filled with pity, some with awe, and some with a terrifying curiosity. I signaled to the bandleader, but I didn't ask for the eternal love ballad. I asked for a song that was older, deeper, a song about coming home to oneself. As the first notes filled the room, I didn't wait for a partner who wasn't coming. I began to move. At first, it was small, a slow sway, a closing of my eyes as I let the music anchor me to the present moment. I wasn't dancing with a ghost. I wasn't imagining Julian's hand on my waist or his breath against my ear. I was feeling the strength in my own spine. I was feeling the way my feet held the earth. I began to spin, the heavy fabric of my skirt flaring out around me in a great, defiant circle of white lace. I wasn't a half looking for its other. I was a whole, complete and unbroken, claiming every inch of the space I occupied. I danced for the girl who had ignored her gut for 5 years. I danced for the woman who had been told she was too much and not enough in the same breath. I danced until the heartbeat of the music was the only thing I could feel. The pity in the room didn't just fade, it evaporated, replaced by a raw, visceral energy that made the air feel thick. I saw my bridesmaids standing at the edge of the floor, tears streaming down their faces,
Not tears of sadness, but the kind of tears you shed when you see something truly beautiful and terrifyingly honest. I wasn't a bride who had been left. I was a woman who had arrived. As the final notes of the song lingered in the rafters, I didn't bow to an invisible partner. I stood in the center of the floor, my chest heaving, my head held high, and I looked at my reflection in the dark glass walls of the pavilion. I saw Zara, not Julian Zara, but the Zara I had almost lost. And then something happened that wasn't in any wedding manual. My father stepped onto the floor, but he didn't reach for my hand to lead me. He simply stood beside me and began to move to the new, upbeat tempo the band had struck. Then my brother joined, then my mother. Within minutes, the entire dance floor was a sea of people, a chaotic, joyous, and fiercely loyal crowd of humans who weren't dancing for a marriage, but for a resurrection. We danced until the candles burned low, until my feet ached, and until the memory of Julian's betrayal was buried under the weight of 1,000 happy footsteps. I realized then that a first dance doesn't have to be a beginning with someone else. It can be the first time you finally agree to walk the rest of your life with yourself.
The music eventually softened, transitioning from the high-energy roar of a celebration to a low, melodic hum as the night began to lean toward its end. The adrenaline that had carried me through the exposure at the altar and the defiance of the dance floor started to settle, replaced by a deep, grounded exhaustion. I sat in a comfortable armchair near the glass doors that led back to the lake, watching the steam rise from a fresh cup of tea. It was in these quiet moments that the real family began to reveal itself. It wasn't just the people I shared blood with. It was the people who had stood their ground when the world around me turned into a landslide. One by one, they came to find me, not with the cloying, suffocating pity I had feared, but with a quiet, fierce respect that felt like a warm blanket. My mother sat on the ottoman at my feet, her hands, the same hands that had helped me button the hundreds of tiny pearls on my back, now resting firmly on my knees. For years, she had been the one to encourage my patience with Julian, believing that his ambition and sharp edges were just the marks of a successful man. But tonight, the veil had been lifted for her, too. "I spent so much time worrying about the wedding being perfect, Zara," she whispered, her voice thick with a regret that made my heart ache. "I was so focused on the flowers, the guest list, and the traditions that I stopped looking at your eyes. I didn't see that you were disappearing." I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to reassure her. I didn't have to pretend I was okay for her sake. "I'm not disappearing anymore, Mom," I said. "I'm finally taking up space." We sat there in a silence that was finally honest, a bridge being built over years of keeping up appearances. My brother Leo came over next, carrying 2 plates of the wedding cake we had never officially cut. He handed me one and sat on the floor beside my chair, his presence a solid, immovable weight. Leo had never liked Julian. He had always sensed the predatory nature behind the polished smile, but he had kept his peace because he wanted me to be happy. "You know," he said, taking a massive bite of the lemon zest cake, "I had a whole speech prepared about how lucky Julian was to have you. I'm glad I don't have to give it. It would have been a lie." He looked up at me, his eyes sharp. "What you did out there, that took more than just guts. It took a kind of soul strength most people never find. You didn't just save yourself, Zara. You saved our whole family from being part of his hollow story." We ate the cake in a companionable silence, the sugar a strange, sweet contrast to the bitterness of the day's revelations. But the most surprising moment came from my bridesmaids, the 3 women who had remained after Leela's disgraceful exit.
They gathered around me like a shield, their colorful silk dresses a stark contrast to my white lace. They told me stories of things they had seen but hadn't known how to tell me. The way Leela would linger a second too long in Julian's presence, the strange tension in the air when the three of them were in a room together. They apologized for their silence, their voices overlapping in a chorus of, "I should have said something," and "I was so afraid to be wrong." I realized then that betrayal rarely happens in a complete vacuum. It leaves ripples that others feel, but often ignore out of a fear of breaking the peace. The peace was already broken. It was just a quiet break. In that moment, the friendship I thought I had lost with Leela was replaced by a deeper, more resilient bond with these women. We weren't just bridal party anymore. We were a circle of witnesses. As the last of the guests began to filter out toward the shuttles, the pavilion felt different. It was no longer a place of performance. It was a place where a reckoning had happened. I looked at the empty chairs, the scattered petals, and the half-drunk glasses of champagne, and I didn't see a ruined wedding. I saw a cleared field. My father approached me, his tuxedo jacket gone, his sleeves rolled up. He didn't say much, he never was a man of many words, but he leaned down and kissed my forehead, his hand lingering on my shoulder for a long, steady moment. "I've never been prouder to be your father than I am tonight." That was all. It was the only blessing I actually needed. I realized that Julian had tried to isolate me by making me believe that my only value was in being his wife. But as I sat surrounded by the people who truly knew me, I saw that I was more than a wife, more than a bride, and certainly more than a victim. I was the center of a tribe that was stronger than any lie he could ever tell.
The first light of the following morning was not the soft, deceptive gold of the wedding day. It was a sharp, clinical silver that cut through the mist rising off the lake, exposing the reality of the aftermath. I woke up in the bridal suite, alone, but for the first time in 5 years, the silence didn't feel like a weight. It felt like an invitation. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the white silk dress draped over the chair, like the skin of a version of myself I had finally outgrown. The pearls were still there, the lace was still intricate, but the magic was gone, replaced by the solid, unyielding truth. I didn't feel the newlywed glow the magazines promised, nor did I feel the soul-crushing despair Julian had expected. I felt a quiet, terrifyingly beautiful sense of ownership. The world, of course, did not stop turning just because my life had exploded. By mid-morning, the digital ripples of what I had done at the altar had turned into a tidal wave. Julian's carefully constructed world was the first to fall. Because I had used the wedding screen to display the evidence, there were 200 witnesses, many of them his high-level business associates. The reputation he had prioritized over my heart was incinerated in a single night. I heard later that his firm placed him on administrative leave within 48 hours. They couldn't risk the scandal of a man whose personal integrity was so publicly bankrupt. He tried to call me, of course. He sent long, rambling emails from his car, from hotels, from the various dark corners he had retreated to. He begged for a civil conversation. He tried to frame my actions as unnecessarily cruel. I didn't reply. I didn't have to. I simply blocked his number and forwarded his messages to my lawyer. Julian Carter had spent 5 years making me small. I spent 5 seconds making him a memory. As for Lila, the punishment was perhaps more intimate and more permanent. The sisterhood she had used as camouflage was gone. She was erased from our social circles with a surgical precision.
I was told she left the state within a week, unable to handle the looks of disgust from people who had once welcomed her into their homes. But the real consequence wasn't the social exile. It was the realization that she had destroyed her life for a man who didn't even try to defend her the night the lights came on. Julian didn't run after her that night. He didn't check if she was okay. He was too busy trying to save his own skin. Lila had to face the reality that she wasn't the great love he was waiting for. She was just the instrument he used to hurt me. She has to live with that knowledge every time she sees her reflection. I didn't take a honeymoon. Instead, I took a journey back to myself. I kept the house. I had paid for it, most of it anyway, but I stripped it of every memory that smelled like his cologne or sounded like his lies. I repainted the walls, I changed the locks, and I filled the rooms with the things he had always called clutter. My books, my half-finished canvases, and the loud, joyous music he used to tell me to turn down. I started a new chapter, not as a woman who had been left, but as a woman who had finally arrived. I looked at the gold ring on my right hand every morning as a reminder. I am the only person who is required to stay with me for the rest of my life. I had better be someone I can trust.
They say a wedding is the beginning of a story. But they never tell you that sometimes the most important story is the one you end. They called me a bride, but I chose to be a witness. They thought I would be destroyed by the humiliation, but I found my glory in the truth. I didn't lose a husband that day. I gained a life that actually belongs to me. I learned that you can walk down an aisle lined with white roses and still be walking into a trap, and that the bravest thing you can ever do is turn that trap into a platform. If you've ever had to choose your dignity over your comfort, I want to see you in the comments. Type "I choose me" and tell me one thing you've reclaimed for yourself this year. We are a community of architects, and we don't build on lies. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to know that being alone is better than being with a ghost. Thank you for being part of Echoes of Love and Betrayals. My name is Naomi, and I am finally, beautifully awake. Until next time, stay strong, stay true, and never be afraid to dance alone.